So yeah, hello everyone. I'm really delighted today to have with us Dr. Hedley Swain, who is a friend and colleague for many years, and is currently a director at the Royal Pavilion and Museums Trust in Brighton. Any of you who visited Brighton will remember that big dome building right at the center. Looks a bit like the Taj Mahal, and that's where he's the director and chief executive of that. But Hedley also brings to the table a lot, he's a lot of experience about history and heritage. He is by profession a historian. He has got a PhD. And then he's also, we work together. He was on the board of the Museums, Libraries and Archives Trust, where I first met him around 2009, 2010. And then since then, he's gone on to be a director of the Arts Council. And then now, currently, he's the chief executive of this very large museum and heritage collection, which actually has got close links with India, and we'll come on to that later. So first of all, Hedley, thank you so much for coming to this. And just to brief you, we've been doing a whole series of interviews about migration and assimilation within the Jain diaspora in Britain. And we want to continue that project because what we're finding is that lots of very interesting facts and, and information about how people have adjusted and how the culture has traveled and continues to survive in spite of this very different, very white canvas that is Britain, So we want to dig deeper into that. And in your case, uh, you have actually also taken the time out to come to our community and see us from the inside out, not the outside in, not as a painting or a canvas, but actually experience us as a group of people during a festival. And you've also, through our friendship, you've also encouraged me to do more. And also you've hosted a meeting of Jain artists at the Arts Council. Again, that was a major historic event in terms of breaking that barrier, because a lot of Jain artists never thought that they could apply to the Arts Council for a grant, and you were very encouraging and all of that. So in that sense, we are kind of at one level trying to cross two very different worlds, but there are also meeting points within that. So can you tell us a little bit about why you think oral history of migration is important to the heritage of Britain?
Thanks, Atul, and thanks for having me, and thank you for being so kind. And I'm really honoured to be talking to you, and really be honoured to be part of the project. I mean, I guess it should go without saying, and we all know, all of those old cliches about history is mainly written by people in power at any one time, and it's always written very partially, and that most people through most of history don't have a voice and aren't involved in any way, and yet those are often the most interesting stories. And we know that it's very easy to tell history in a very simplistic way, to make it as simple as possible. And we all know that to really understand history and really understand communities, really understand people, it's very complicated. And you do need to get under the bonnet and you need to understand it. And the most powerful thing you need to do is hear every voice. All communication should be 360 degree. And most communication is just one way, 1 degree, one person talking to someone else. And that in any situation, the more voices you hear and the more opinions you hear, the richer the experience. And things with migration, almost always the power is uneven, and so the story is often told by one group from one position of power. And therefore, the more voices we can bring to the story, the better. So that it's that we will have richer lives. We will be richer people, all of us. The more we understand the world around us, the more voices we hear. So I think that's important. And then also, this is a powerful story, and the story of migration, and we see it played out every day in Britain at the moment. Almost every day you turn on the news, and you'll see someone like David Lammy being accused of not being English by a white person, and he will say, but you need to understand the story of migration, and you need to understand the story of migration to Britain, and the fact that Britain has always been a story of migration and continues to be, and it's what makes Britain so rich. So the more we understand that story, and it's a story that's been used politically for all the wrong reasons, and therefore again, the more we understand every side of the story, the more we can try and break that down. And I mean, there are so many facets to this. Do you know the largest number of European migrants, from one country in other countries? So I haven't put that very well, but if you think that, which country has delivered most migrants to other countries in Europe? Britain. So, all of those Brits in Spain and elsewhere, but they don't call themselves migrants, they call themselves expats. So they've invented a language to, so that they'll accuse, migrants are seen as, that's a negative thing. Expats is a wonderful thing. And yet, it's just so much more complicated than that. So crudely, the richer we can make the story, the better for everyone. And we will make it richer by having more and more voices. And the more voices we involve. So the work you're doing to bring an extra dimension of voices to this story, that can only make it better. And as a historian and archaeologist, I'm very conscious that every nation has its own origin myth. It has its own mythology of how it became a country. I've probably talked to you about this before. And in England, when you say, okay, what's England's origin myth? You talk about Stonehenge, the Roman invasion, 1066, Henry VIII and his 6 wives, Queen Victoria, the Empire, World War I, World War II, the Beatles. Those are our origin myths. And of course, what you immediately do with that origin myth is you realize there's a whole lot of stuff that isn't there that should be there. And I would like to think what we're slowly doing, and the work you're doing is contributing to that, is altering and improving England's origin myth. So I think, I was involved back in 2007 when we had the bicentenary of the end of the transatlantic slavery trade in Britain. That the slave trade had been kind of ignored up until then. You talked about American slavery, we hadn't kind of talked about it. And what we managed to do was kind of bring that into Britain's origin myth. Now, we did it from a very white, Anglo-centric way. It was all about us, Wilberforce, ending slavery. It wasn't about the fact we had been slave owners, but at least we started to, bring that into the origin myth. And I think, Windrush, we've managed to drag that into Britain's origin myth. So we now talk about the Empire of Windrush and the arrival of West Indian migrants and the fact they were welcomed and the fact they were coming to help us. And there are other parts of Britain's origin myth that we need to bring in. And the work you're doing, the movement of people from the Indian subcontinent to Britain, and the incredible cultural diversity and wealth they brought, and that most of them often came from East Africa, and they have this incredible story where they've now got 3 homes. I always feel left out. I've only got one origin myth, growing up in Southeast London as a white person. And whenever I speak to often somebody from an Indian culture who can talk about India and East Africa and English experience, it always feels so much richer to me. And so we need to add this incrementally to what our British origin myth is, and recognise how rich it is. And it isn't just about kings and battles and such things. So anyway, I hope that kind of in a
Yeah.
roundabout way.
I mean, the British expats in Spain that you spoke about, sadly, they don't even speak Spanish.
They don't speak Spanish, and most of them voted for Brexit, and then were surprised that that meant they were going to have to leave. But that's kind of almost beside the point. But it's
so the
that
richness.
sense that migrants come to Britain,
Yeah.
but Brits become expats. It's a weird
And also,
tautology of language.
yeah, but culturally, and you make this point quite nicely. I mean, if you look at the Jain culture, it's one of the oldest living cultures of the world. It's founded on a principle of non-violence and respect, not just for all human, but for all living beings, so including nature. So, and then we got a whole art, you got a whole series of rituals, festivals, beliefs, leader, community values, social cohesion, all this behind it, which we've brought with us, not in our bags, but in our hearts and souls, right? Now, if you were to visualize the Britain of the future, Britain needs to embrace climate change, not just in terms of carbon zero, but in terms of strong ethical values like respect for all living beings, right? So we are actually, and as you so nicely put, we are enriching Britain through our very presence and through our day-to-day actions. You actually told me once that you are making history every day. You, as in all Jains in this country, through their day-to-day actions, are making history. Making history, Hedley, we never thought of ourselves in that way. We thought of ourselves as struggling, adapting, but making history. Are you putting us on a pedestal, Hedley?
I always have incredible respect for it's a fascinating thing that humans, people, always seem to be quite resistant to change. We don't like the idea of change. We like, and yet we're very good at it. We are very good at it, but it is tough, and it's about adaptability. It is about changing. It's about clinging on to what's really important, and therefore I've got great respect for all cultures and communities that have had to be forced to go through change and adaptability. But what I've almost always found is it makes them richer, because what they would do, and this is a great example for the Jain community, that when you are forced to go through that kind of change, forced migration, economic migration, other sorts of movement, you realize what's really important to you as a culture, and it becomes even more important to you. But what you also have to do is adapt and make it fit in the new circumstances. So what I've always loved about the Jain community, and going to your community centres, is seeing a living, vibrant community that has deep respect for its past and for its community, but is also adapting and living in, an alien environment. It's almost Darwinian, the survival of the fittest, that thing about, it's only when you have something really challenged that you realize how adaptable you are, how strong you are, what's really important to you. And I think, without being harsh, some traditional white communities could do with having some change forced on them to really realize what's important to them and what's worth saving, and what art and culture, how great their art and culture is, instead of just taking it for granted. And I've always loved the way you are so proud of Jain art and culture and everything about the Jain community. You have a deep held pride for it. But what you also do, without patronizing, is you operate 100% in British life, and you've often found that hard, but you've adapted to it, and you've beaten it, and you've been a success in it, while clinging to that great culture. And that's kind of what making history is. It's adapting to change. If there was no change and no adaptability to change, there would be no history. You know, there were just, it's somebody once described to me, you know, the end of the universe will be when nothing is changing anymore and everything is the same. So if you think of it in terms of physics, and this is an astrophysical thing, and apparently, you know, this will happen in billions of years' time, all molecules would have broken down so they would all be the same and they would no longer be changing. And at that point, in effect, time will end and the universe will end because nothing is happening. And therefore, the opposite of that, which is constant change, constant movement, and lots of variety, is the opposite of death, if you like. It's life in its fullest sense. And I have huge respect for the Jain community, but you know, you could also talk about the Sikh community. You could talk about, you know, many communities that have had to go through change, have had to go through adaptability, have had to evolve, and it's you know, almost always when you see them at their best and see the best of what has gone before, but always see the best of them, you know, adapting. And the way that, you know, members of the Indian community have adapted to British life, in terms of their businesses and how they work and their work ethic, and, you know, family life is wonderful. And, you know, it's not always easy. You know, we've seen lots and lots of examples where it doesn't quite work and it goes wrong and you get conflict. But at the heart of it all, you know, that adapting to new circumstances will, in the end, almost always, you know, deliver something positive, I think.
Wow, thank you. That's really helpful and actually very inspiring. And you know, as you said, I mean, we do that adaptation very peacefully and in a law-abiding way. So in a sense, we want to minimize the burden on the state, and improve the economy, create jobs, you know, educate people, take others with us, be a good neighbor, be a good citizen, all of that. And yet, because we are politically quiet, because we are also artistically not very engaged with the arts establishment, we often do not get heard. You are saying that your voices are important, but the voices are not really being respected and heard in our own context. I mean, for example, you know, one of the things I constantly encounter, and in fact, our young people, I mean, you mentioned me as a proud Jain, but if you ask many of our young people today, they would not be proud Jains, unfortunately, sadly, right? One, partly because they've been born in this country against that canvas, and so they've constantly, at one level, been forced to kind of fit in. But at another level, they see the religion as, in a way, as kind of ritualistic and backward, right, rather than scientific and creative and forward looking. So we have that educational challenge within the community. But I must say that the wider society has not really come to respect us. The constant question we get is, how do you spell the word Jain, right? So can you advise us on what we can do as a community to address these kinds of challenges, especially for our young people and those of whom who are trying to be artists? And there are some really, you've kindly met Deshna, who we interviewed for our series recently, and you know, they are really trying to be that bridge and to create that hope, you know.
I think it's really interesting. I think there is that very particular challenge. You're absolutely right about the Jain community in that it isn't well understood and well known. And just like you, I spend a lot of time talking about, I've been with my friend Atul, he's a Jain, and then I'll have to explain what, you know, for many intelligent Brits, what that is. So you're absolutely right about that. And also about, I can imagine absolutely for young people. I mean, white young people reject, you know, family value, you know, their authority and such things. So I think firstly, don't fight it too hard, because if you fight it too hard, the minute you're fighting to preserve something, it becomes something else. And that's kind of what we've done with British culture. If you think, a lot of our traditions have become almost fossilized or mummified instead of being living. You can't fight it that hard. You have to kind of go with a little bit. I think to continue to encourage art and culture in all of its forms. I think what is quite interesting is that often the most radical European artists, however radical and however they fight against tradition, almost always they come back to it in the end because it's their roots. So not fighting too hard and trusting that if something is rich enough, people will come back to it and respect it. I always remember, people like, the artist Anthony Gormley and the fashion designer Vivienne Westwood, who were absolutely anti-establishment and hated everything about British culture, later in their careers came back to a deep respect for the origins of British culture and such things. So I think it is, so celebrate your artists and celebrate what they're doing, and give them the space and the room to recognize what they've come from. And I feel confident they will come back to it. And I think that question about Jain culture in Britain is an interesting one. And I think it would be worth a longer conversation, because firstly you need to decide, well, what do we actually want here? Do we want to, and I think just understanding and respect is enough, and that doesn't need a lot more. It's interesting. We might talk more about the Royal Pavillion here where I work, but in 1914 and 1915, it was used as a hospital for injured Indian soldiers. And it's a very important part of Brighton history now. But they always talk about Muslim, Sikh and Hindu soldiers, and that each of them had their own kitchen and their own food and their own funeral. And nobody has ever yet mentioned me Jain. And I'm guessing there would have been Jain soldiers as well,
Because we fought in the Indian army, so we would have been, yes.
Yeah. So I'm not denying you've got an uphill struggle, because you're right. And you will know this depressingly, that too many white Brits are very happy to lump in everyone from India without even differentiating between Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim, without worrying them. Oh, and you've got to remember the Jains as well, and all the other groups. But I think that would be a very interesting discussion for the Jain community to decide, well, what sort of recognition do we want, and how would we go about achieving that? Mm-hmm. And is it saying we need a Jain character in EastEnders, or do we need a really great Jain author to write the equivalent of Small Island, but I think the work you're doing, small steps. I think sooner or later. There have been good exhibitions. There have been great exhibitions at the V&A and other places.
And through my work on the board of First Sight Art Gallery, people came to understand a little bit about the Jains, but more importantly, they saw my leadership skills. They saw me assimilating with a British public institution, part of the Tate Gallery network, which you were also involved in very much. And through that, people could see that, there is some culture behind that. And
so absolutely. So those strong figures in society, and that's why some of the artists, some of the musicians, some of the artists, as they gain prominence, people will ask them, well, we can't take you superficially anymore. We need to know actually in detail
Mm.
what your background is and where your inspirations have come from, and that will give people a voice.
Yeah. I mean, one other thing that has intrigued me about you, Hedley, is your deep respect for faith. I mean, we live in a time where most intellectuals are secular and very, very proudly so. And yet, when I talk to them about India, I try to say that this divide between secular and non-secular doesn't doesn't exist in the world. Actually, that the world is both secular and non-secular. We have been infused by faith in so many ways, and even that person who says to you that I am an atheist, actually, when you look at their lifestyle and their culture and character, you will find elements of faith in their conduct. So how is it? And even the art establishment where you have worked has drawn this kind of clear line,
Yeah.
right, with religion. But you understand that actually it is all connected, and in fact, in that connection comes a richness.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think there are several things there. I mean, being a historian and an archaeologist and studying people around the world is exactly as you say. You are that most people have faith of some kind, and most people have a culture that comes out of a faith. And as you've just said, Atul, even if you took someone like Richard Dawkins, a devout atheist, and analysed his life, he's been brought up within a Western Christian. He would have been influenced by it, and we all are. We all are. So, what I have, as you say, firstly, I have huge respect for anyone. The world's a difficult place. You should have respect for everyone. The recognition that I'm a great cultural relativist. I guess that's really important to me. I obviously have strong belief in my particular worldview, but I absolutely respect everyone else's right to their worldview. And I may have told, I'm sure I have told you, years ago, about 15, 16 years ago, I was responsible for the British government's guidance on the repatriation of human remains that have been collected in the imperial colonial period. So lots of British museums had acquired skeletons of people from around the empire, particularly from Australia and New Zealand. And those indigenous people were beginning to say, well, we want our ancestors returned to us. And what I did was spent a lot of time listening to the beliefs of different communities. And for Australian Aborigines, it's, against every essence of them, that their ancestors shouldn't be in the ground where their ancestors came from. So the fact that they would be in a museum box thousands of miles away was deeply, deeply hurtful to them. And of course, I did not buy into their faith, but what I could see was the complete sincerity of it and how it was hurting them. And therefore, for me, there was no question that their rights should be listened to. And it was also interesting then talking to the British scientists who were caring for those skeletons and listening to their view. You realized it was in its way as religiously fundamental. Science must come first. We have a right for this over them. It was even more fundamentalist than the Aboriginal views. And that realization that all of us believe vehemently in our view, in particular views, and it's because of our background. Once you realize that, you can't hopefully be anything other than a cultural relativist and accept that different people have different views and different views are valid to them in different ways.
Yeah. So about the story of the elephant and the blind man. I mean, the Jains have the philosophy of anekant, which is similar to exactly what you say, that truth is multifaceted and depends on the perspective of the seer. It doesn't mean we give up the search for objectivity, but at the same time, we should understand that different people will see truth from a different lens because of their
Yeah.
different experiences and cultures and upbringings,
Yeah.
So it's quite an interesting time actually with, Black Lives Matter, decolonizing the curriculum, and this whole idea of more inclusivity in culture and the heart. So you would think that this is a great opportunity for people like the Jains to stand up and be heard. But we're not kind of feeling that. And I personally, I am really excited. I've written a book. You very kindly launched my book on Jainism and ethical finance. And then I've written this book on reinventing accounting and finance education, which I wrote before the decolonizing and Black Lives Matter movement. But what I did here was to not only decolonize, but at the same time embrace the whole sustainability agenda and climate change agenda. So, whilst we are rewriting the past, let us also embrace the future. And now that, and you understand Jainism so well, I didn't use the word Jainism in the second book as such. But if you look at the framing of it, my culture played an important part in the framing of it. But now what I'm trying to do is to show the whole world that, look, here is a great opportunity to draw different cultures into the education curriculum, learn from them, and at the same time embrace this thing called nature, not as other, but nature as us. These are all kind of core values. So in that sense, and again, your point about every Jain making history, I know so many members of the community, they would never think of themselves in this way. But when I look at their actions, how they work in their professions, in their neighborhoods, uh, in the way they bring up the children, the parenting, it is the leadership that they provide. And most of the time, it's very quiet leadership. They don't want to be heard. They, in a way, they don't want. In fact, I'm probably allowed, Jane, from that point of view. They actually they don't even see as leadership. Sometimes they just say, "Well, it's my duty. I have to do this." And I see that whole canvas and I think, what an amazing story. And you remember the Masala tour of Britain that I did in
Mm.
2010 to
Mm.
bring out elements of this story from all over Britain to show that there are many communities and cultures in Britain who actually do this. They will never make the news, but in a very quiet way, they're building these bridges of hope and opportunity for everyone, not just for themselves. So, how can we, given your vast experience of heritage and the arts, and all these lovely institutions and buildings all over the country, millions and millions of pounds of funding, how can we have some space in that in that in that structure? How can we have some space, some ability to exhibit and share, and to also protect our own culture and arts, because
I,
at the
I
moment.
think you're right that the door is half open at the moment, and it just needs to be very gently pushed. And I think you're right that there is a real appetite in arts and culture, even more to mainstream diversity. I'm very boring. I listen to Radio 3, but even Radio 3, it's very refreshing how, mostly it is the Western canon, but, there will be, there are opportunities and there are moments, and, Radio 6 is even better. I think it's funny, talking about the Jain community being quiet. The Huguenot community used to be called the quiet. Historically, the Huguenot community were the French Protestants who left France because they were being persecuted by Catholics and came to Britain. And many of them were silk merchants, and they lived in places like Spitalfields, which is quite interesting because Spitalfields then later became where the Jewish community settled, and then later again parts of the Indian, Pakistani and other Indian communities. So it's always been an area for migrants, and it started with the Huguenots, and that has been called the Quiet Revolution, or because they didn't make a big fuss, but they were really important. And I wouldn't worry. I'd be quite proud of that, the Quiet Revolution kind of thing. But making sure, saying to all of your artists, when you get to Radio 3, remember to say that you're a Jain. Remember to say where your culture has come from. And I would have hoped that organizations like the Migration Museum and other museums would be interested in talking about the Jain story. And of course, the project you're doing, because the project you're doing will reveal stories and voices that should be heard. And I think the interesting thing is thinking about how the Jain story is distinct from other migration stories, and that might be a challenge. I mean, we've talked about the professions, the particular professions that are often favoured by Jains, that the subtle differences with the religious belief, but thinking about what would a Jain's experience be of coming from India to Uganda to England, as opposed to a Hindus or Sikhs or someone else. I haven't got any easy answers for you, but I think that the idea of a quiet revolution that continues to assimilate and evolve, but be very proud of their culture, but also happy for it to adapt.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, coming back to the young people in our community, I think we need people like you to come and also speak to our young people, and in a way, because they're going to Oxford and Cambridge, where nobody cares whether they're a Jain, nobody even bothers to ask them, and nobody knows. And then they're going to other universities as well, but even in many academics are very proudly secular, especially social scientists, and they refuse to even talk about faith, so in all that kind of dimensions, and I also think some very practical things like management, leadership, citizenship, um, diversity and inclusion, in all these areas, if we started with our young to somehow help our young to see that their culture has got some really good principles which are very timely, very scientific, and very relevant. Even, for example, to be a good professional, you need to be a kind of servant leader, you need to be disciplined, you need to have integrity, and these elements are in your upbringing. Even something like a joint family, people used to kind of frown upon. It's not a norm in this country, but I'm noticing that those children who lived with their grandparents have such a deep culture about them, such a deep respect for heritage. They also speak the language, and that, having lived with the grandparents has made such a difference. Whereas, we live in a society where it's almost like everyone's independent and you have to kind of live independently. But we're seeing that. So it's not all bad to not live in a joint family. And joint families also mean lots of sharing and caring, and also means intergenerational transfer of knowledge, of wisdom, of culture, etc.
Yeah, I think going back to what I said about the idea of an origin myth and Britain's, constructing a Jain origin myth, so that that the story of the Jains' travel to Britain and what that has involved, that's a good story. You almost need to equip people with the tools for understanding their culture. We often forget that many people don't don't have those. So giving people a really, I don't know if there is a, a good readable written history of the Jain culture over the last 200 years, or the Jain experience of coming to Britain that people would be able to read, and suddenly you would become more proud of your culture if you understood it that way, and a really good understanding. You almost need the easy version of Jain music, architecture, other things. So you can equip people with an understanding of what that culture is. And then those values, you're right, the simplifying down and reminding people that Jain values are so influential on world values at the moment. And as you said, you could write down some of the stuff that even some people like obviously people like Greta Thunberg, but if you wrote down some of the stuff Joe Biden has probably said recently, you could tick off the number of things that would resonate with Jain community. So that reminder of all the things you've said. But the only thing I'd say, going back to what I said earlier, is that with young people in particular, the last thing you can do is force anything on them, because that's not what they're interested in. And of course, you have to give them some space. And it's ironic, as I've said to you, I feel in many ways, I feel very jealous of how cultural I am, that I have one culture and I've lived in one place. And I feel jealous of others who haven't, but also I cannot begin to understand what it is like to be somebody second, third generation from the Indian subcontinent in Britain right now. And of course, for young Muslims, it's a nightmare. So, any young British Muslim who was born after 9/11, that how difficult it is for them. And of course, they're either going to find it difficult to find their place in the world. So I'm in many ways the last really person to offer advice, because I haven't got personal experience.
No, but that's a very, very helpful, this idea of some kind of an origin myth, and also the idea of repeating these messages, not just repeating and reinforcing these messages so that people develop that sense of self-esteem. I mean, for example, this pandemic has revealed the importance of community. Now, we've taken community for granted until the pandemic, and then suddenly we realize, hang on a minute, and you can't build a community in a pandemic. Either you have it or you don't, right? So now we're valuing that community, and we're valuing that sense of togetherness.
But also the pandemic, the pandemic has exaggerated everything, hasn't it? So you're right, community has become really important, but it's also a great tragedy that actually it particularly badly affected South Asian families in places like Leicester, who were living multiple generations with some of the older generations not speaking English and not trusting the NHS and things like that. And then you suddenly realize, okay, there were great strengths here, but there were also great weaknesses. And it's that thing about adapting and evolving is also really important.
Thank you. So no, all that is really helpful, and thanks for all your encouragement. I guess I'll give you a few minutes to speak, to give a general message to our artists in the community and culture, people who are, many of them actually don't see it as a profession, they see it as a hobby, but they absolutely give 100% to it. They really are proud about it. I mean, what given that your experience as a professional kind of leader in the heritage sector, and having worked with so many artists over the years, what would be your message to our artists?
So I think the first thing is to everyone, recognizing we all have cultural lives, we all have creative lives, we all listen to music, we all draw, paint, we are all creative, and all of that creative creativity is of value and all makes our lives richer, whatever it is we do, however bad we are, however good we are, dancing, singing, all of that is good for us. And it doesn't have to be professional, but you should embrace it. Everyone should seek to be creative. Nobody should not, if you get the opportunity to sing, dance, paint, draw, you should take it. If you get the opportunity to go to an art gallery, go to the theatre, do. If you get the opportunity to come into contact with art and culture that is not familiar to you, take it. It will always be a good experience. Even if you hate it, it will be a good experience. I think then, for me, creative people are the most valuable people in society. They're the most valuable people in the world. They're the people that bring true value to the world, and they're the people that make sense of the world. Of course, it is difficult to be a professional artist. It always will be, and you don't have to be a professional artist, you know, if you're being creative. But then what I would say is that, and we touched upon this, right now, there is a real appetite throughout Britain, throughout the world, for diverse arts and to understand it and embrace it. So the Jains have got an incredibly rich architectural, musical, visual culture. Celebrate it, enjoy it at every level, enjoy it if you're bad at it, enjoy it if you're good at it, but do share it and do seek to share it, and do, you know, Arts Council will fund your work. Theatres, venues, festivals will put it on. And as I've said to different artists I've spoken to in the past, if you're feeling a little bit scared by it or a little bit frightened by it, find somebody who isn't. You know, that the country is full of artists who are equally keen to work with artists from other cultures. So, you know, if you are a great Jain musician and you would like to perform at a music festival or do something, find that music festival, talk to the artists, get to know them, because, you know, the artists are, creative people are incredibly generous and want to learn and want to embrace new things. So don't let that be a reason not to do it, that you're not familiar with it. There are plenty of people out there who are ready to help you become familiar with it.
So it's very interesting. You said that creative people are very important in society. We have a very wealthy business community, but as a community, our investment in arts and artists is relatively very low compared to our history. I mean, if you think of the temples we built in India, you know, it was considered the highest honor for a businessman to donate towards a temple. Today, you got to literally kind of beg and knock the door a few hundred times before you might get some support. So something has gone awry there, you know, and I think the business community has become quite functional as well. So what can you say to our business leaders who are excellent?
So I don't know the exact cultural circumstances there, but I can quite imagine, you know, lots of Indian people. I've had to work really hard recently, you know, to get where they are. But that idea of philanthropy, and as you say, it's incredibly rich amongst Indian communities. Do celebrate your artists and do celebrate your culture, and there are huge rewards that come from that. And you're right, there is more of a tradition in sort of Western culture for artistic philanthropy, but it's still not huge. But yeah, I mean, it has to be an ecology. You know, there will always be some public money. There will always be people who are prepared to work for small amounts of pay, but we need a mixed economy. And therefore we do need members of the Indian community who can afford to to play a role. And I know that some of them do, but we do need more of it. And that should be absolutely part of your mix in terms of promoting Jain artists and Jain culture. Absolutely.
Thank you. So tell us about the Brighton Pavilion. You've just come in as a director and chief executive. What are your ambitions and visions, and how can the community support the kind of vision that you have?
So those of you who do know, so Brighton, fabulous city on the south coast, lots of creative people, lots going for it. The Royal Pavillion was built between the late 1700s and the early 1800s as the seaside palace of the Prince Regent, who then became George IV. And those of you who don't know, the architectural style is roughly Mughal, so it's roughly Indian. And there are several buildings in the complex. There is a stables and then the pavilion itself. And it is not based on any accurate Indian building, but it is in an Indian style. And the more you look at it, you realize it's just a pastiche. It's a little bit Chinese, it's a little bit Gothic. It's not Indian, but it is in the Indian style. And then ironically, a lot of the interior is decorated in the Chinese style, in what we call chinoiserie. So it's bizarre, but actually it represents a very, very, very specific point in British history. So if you think that it was at the point when Britain became a world power after defeating the French, it was shortly after the East India Company was in effect exploiting India, and in 1805 sacked Delhi or took Delhi. And it was at the point when we were beginning to trade openly with China, and there was a huge desire for Chinese goods. And then shortly afterwards, that sort of flipped into the Opium War. So it represents in many ways, not a happy or proud moment for Britain, but a very particular moment when we became, a world power with serious interest in India and serious interest in China. And all of that is reflected in the pavilion. And I think recognizing that and understanding it is really important. And one of the things that does interest me is that we know that Britain became rich off economic exploitation of India, economic exploitation of China, economic exploitation of Africa. But that for a very short period before that, in what we call the Enlightenment, there was a true openness to other cultures. And actually, the British were fascinated by Indian culture and fascinated by Chinese culture. And the pavilion both represents an unfortunate moment in British history, but it also represents that moment just before that, when Britain was very open to Indian architecture, to Chinese design, and actually had become, the Enlightenment would become very anti-Christianity, anti-traditional Western culture, and we were looking for alternatives. And those, we kind of found those alternatives in India and China, but then very quickly it turned into economic exploitation, and then you had the missionaries, and it all went sour. And so at the same time, so that story, telling that story about how there was a moment when British royalty wanted their palace to look Indian and wanted the inside to look Chinese because they were fascinated by Chinese and Indian culture, but very quickly that went from a positive to a negative, is a really interesting story, and the story I think we need to tell more here. So that's part of it. I mentioned to you that in 1915, the pavilion was turned into a hospital for Indian soldiers, and it was partly propaganda. They liked the idea that these wounded Indian soldiers would wake up and be looked after inside an Indian palace, looked after by white English nurses, that they were looked after properly, that their religions were respected. There is a chatri, a monument on the South Downs here where the dead soldiers were cremated according to religious beliefs. And that's another, that's another powerful story for us here. And India, Brighton now does have a big Indian community. I've got two members of the India community on my board of trustees here, and I'm very keen that we embrace that community, and we can use our origin myth, the origins of the pavilion, the First World War, to embrace that community and draw them in. And one of the things I'm really excited about doing, I hope to do soon, is start having contemporary Indian artists and contemporary Chinese artists responding to the pavilion, inside it. So I can't, we can't take away what it is, but what we can do is invite contemporary Indians and contemporary Chinese to reflect on it and respond to it in terms of its historical context. So who knows, in a couple of years when we begin to get back onto an even keel, it would be lovely to have Jain artists responding to the fake Mughal architecture of the Royal Pavilion with their contemporary art.
Thank you. And one story which really comes close to what you're trying to do is, in Croydon, we have a large community, and we actually have a Jain temple in Croydon, not far from you.
Yeah, not far.
And there was a lady, a teacher from Africa called Kusum Shah, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But she started a language school. She arrived in the 70s, and very quickly she started to work with the children and the community, and a Gujarati language school. And then alongside the language, she started to teach the arts, Indian arts and music. And then alongside that, she also put Jainism. And so as part of this oral history project, we brought together her former students who are now doctors, lawyers, opticians, accountants, entrepreneurs. And they're about 30 years old, 25, 30 years old. And they were remembering her with so much pride. They had so much respect for her and love for her. And they think that she gave them so much confidence. She helped them to have their own culture in this canvas, right? And still feel pride in that. She helped them to assimilate. And of course, now they are flourishing in their professional work and careers as well. So we brought all those voices together in the reunion. And I will send you that recording as well. But she was later awarded an MBE, actually, for her work. And of course, now that we are looking at, with this pandemic, we are getting interested in history. And now we started reflecting on that past. We suddenly realized that this woman was actually, like you could say, the Florence Nightingale of Gujarati culture, because she also put Gujarati on the GCSE and the A-level syllabus. And she trained so many teachers. And she just completely, there was no barrier insurmountable for her. And she was very, very thrifty. I mean, these young people said that, with very little resources, she could put a whole show together. She knew how to minimize resources. So that's a kind of story, actually, which could be, which we, in fact, are commissioning as a biography. Some of the young students are very keen to write her biography. But
it's a great story. One of the things I love about Brighton is Brighton has its own blue plaque scheme. The blue plaques where in London, and in London, as you know, they're all the great and the famous. In Brighton, it's very much people like that. People who've made a major contribution to the community, people from different backgrounds. And one of the great things about Brighton is it's incredibly democratic, and not respectful, and recognises community. You know, there's a very strong sense of community in Brighton. So you know, something else for you to think about. It's more difficult with something like the Jain community because you're spread, but in a place, it's a very powerful thing to recognise people like that and recognise, you know, them where they lived and where they taught and such things.
Thank you. No, that's we never thought of that, but that's a really good suggestion. But I think the other thing that you know, modernity, I mean, especially in the world of business, for example, which is so functional, and a lot of our people go, even the professions, they have become very ahistorical in the way they are taught, you know, and therefore it's almost as if you don't need history. You know, history is like going backward, but here we are saying that history is what makes us who we are and has made us who we are. So in a sense, what we also need to do, and we are trying to through this project, is to rekindle that sense of history in our community.
Yeah.
Perhaps when you in the pavilion strategize for the future, think about how you can, for those communities, help rekindle that sense of history, you know,
Yeah.
because it's very powerful and it's needed for us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to keeping in touch. We look forward to sharing this interview with others. I'm sure it will inspire many people, and we will definitely give you some feedback as well. And you know, whoever sees this, please pass it on, because it's so encouraging, so positive, and so honest as well. You know, you've been very frank with us about the past and the present, but at the same time also giving us hope for the future. So we're really grateful. Dr. Hedley Swain, Director of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. Do go and visit when it opens. And if he is there, go and say hello to him. We, you know, and meet him in person. So thank you.
Thank you, Atul. It's absolute honour. Absolute honour. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. I just stay on.